This is John Leibowitz, who's been the FTC chairman since 2009. And under his tenure, the FTC